Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian here, the Third Topics Gamer, here to give you another one of my top 5 list videos to share with you guys today. Now, as you know, there have been a lot of announcements about video game-based movies that should be coming out over the next number of years. But if you actually take a step back and look at the long history of video game-based movies that have come out over the last 30 years, some would say that most of them have had a really bad rap. But there have been a few and very small minority of video game based movies that I would actually consider to be good, if not great films. And I thought I would take this video and use it as an opportunity to go over my personal top 5 favorite video game based movies that I actually think are pretty good. So, if you happen to enjoy this video by the end, I would really like it if you give this video a thumbs up and make sure to press the subscribe button if you happen to enjoy content like this and would like to see more from me. So, starting off with number 5 on my list is going to come to one that actually came out quite recently, and that's got to go to Detective Pikachu. Now, before we go any deeper, this list is going to be focusing on purely live action video game based movies, as if you guys would like me to do a animated top 5 video game based movies list, just let me know and I can get to work on that. But when it comes to Detective Pikachu, I think that the story of a talking Pikachu working with this detective, trying to find out what happened to his dad, interacting in a world where, Pokemon are pretty much walking alongside regular humans here in the real world, I thought was a very interesting concept. It's not personally the type of live action Pokemon story that I personally would like to have seen, but when you take into account that this was the first time they had actually done this, I actually think they did a really good job. I thought the story was actually pretty good. I thought the cast did a really good job. And surprisingly, I was actually surprised with just how well some of these Pokemon actually looked. Some of them did have like a little fluffy or furry effect with them, which is something I actually had never considered what a Pokemon would actually look like in the real world, and even some of their sizes surprised me in comparison to actual normal-sized humans. So I think what Detective Pikachu as a whole does is do a very good job at trying to tell its own unique story and placing it in a setting that I think most fans of Pokemon would have really wished was real. I mean, could you imagine if we were actually living in a Pokemon world? I mean, it'd be crazy. But yeah, it actually also did a pretty good job of showing exactly how effective some of these Pokemons can be in battle. I mean, who wouldn't want a live action Pokemon movie that was like a trainer story? I mean, that's something I think all of us would have wanted to see, because a lot of us who are fans of Pokemon went on our own set of Pokemon trainer journeys. So to see a movie like that possibly in the future would be something that I think most of us would really welcome. But I think that if we are going in that direction, then I think Detective Pikachu was a first good step, and that's something I really do appreciate about it, which is why I would have to put it as number 5 on my list. Now, going into number 4 is really going to surprise a lot of people, but just try to stick with me. But number 4 on my list has got to go to Resident Evil 1. Now, this movie came out in 2002, and a strange twist of fates, this was actually my introduction to the Resident Evil franchise for the very first time, as I wouldn't go on and even try out playing the games for the very first time until some years later with Resident Evil 4, because this was the first time I'd even played a game. But heck, this movie was really my introduction to the franchise. And so when I look back on it and compare it to the rest of the series, I have to admit that this is probably the best one, and these movies just went downhill from here. Now, what I really appreciate about this film in comparison to the rest of the Resident Evil films is that it doesn't suffer from some of the later problems in terms of having characters that are extremely OP, throwing in creatures and characters or even enemies that are just being shoved in, doing a terrible job at portraying iconic characters that are actually from the video game series, and just taking storylines that have no business being placed in your film. I think what the first film does is actually take elements from the Resident Evil world and use them to tell their own unique story. Now, look, when it comes to video game based movies, I don't need a director or a screenwriter to just retell the same story that I already know from the games. In fact, I would actually appreciate it if they didn't do that, because then it's something new, and therefore it's a story that I don't know what's going to happen before it happens. And I think that's the best type of story to tell, especially when you're adapting something from a video game to a movie. And I think that out of all the Resident Evil films that have come out, this one actually did the best job. It actually had characters I generally cared about, a little bit of mystery. The zombies were actually scary, and when they actually did introduce characters or even enemies that were from the games themselves, which even I didn't know they were from, in terms of like the dogs and the lickers, it was actually pretty effective, and dare I say, kind of scary seeing it for the first time. I mean, I was 12 at the time, and who can forget the iconic laser room scene? I mean, that scene was so good that they would actually bring it into the games itself. And when you were able to add something that was never in the games before, but then they decided to add it into their games because of how good it was in the movie, you know you did something right. So without question, out of all of the horrible Resident Evil movies that came in after this one, this was really the best, which is why I would happily put it as number 4 on my list. Now, number 3 on my list is a film that, in my opinion, is severely underrated, and I think that more people should see it if they haven't already, and that has to go to 2010's Prince of Persia from Disney. Now, when you really take into account the source material that this film was based off of, I think that this film did a far better job than I think any one of us could have expected for those that have actually seen it. Because there's no question that this film was based off of the Sands of Time story element. But when you really look at the first game, as great as it is severely lacking in terms of character development, character motivation, story, and really just a lot of variation. Because really to its core, all the first Prince of Persia game is simply a recycled pattern of just doing platforming, puzzles, and fighting in between. And it's like that from beginning to end, and it never once changes that. But I think that what the Prince of Persia movie did was actually give us a lot of depth for our characters, and had a great cast of characters, some impressive action scenes, and I would even say that they actually used the dagger of time very, very sparingly. They didn't want to overuse it. And when they actually do use the dagger, I think the special effects of you seeing time rewind backwards is pretty damn effective. And heck, I would even say this. The only problem I think anyone can really point out about this film is some of the casting choice. Yes, they did cast a couple of white people in the lead roles to play as Persians, and I guess if they had tried that now, that would be considered a little bit offensive, and I think even some people back then thought it was a little bit offensive. But I think that Jake Gyllenhaal actually does a pretty good job at playing the prince and giving him some personality and showing a little bit of cockiness. And in my opinion, that's something that we never got from the prince in the first game, which is why this is without question, in my opinion, the most underrated video game based movie to date. And if you haven't seen it, I would really recommend you go out of your way to see it because it's actually pretty good. Now, when we go into number 2, number 2 is actually probably the most recent video game movie that I've actually seen, and I think that most people, whether you're a fan or not a fan of this series, should really have fun with this film, and that has to go to Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, I will admit, I was more of a Mario fan than a Sonic fan, as my brother was actually in reverse. He was more of a Sonic fan than a Mario fan. But I think that this is a perfect example of the type of video game based movies that we need to see more of moving forward. Because the one thing that I think this film does better than probably most video game based movies is it manages to tell a story that whether you're a fan of the series or not, you very much can be invested into it. It manages to take, again, elements from the games themselves while taking story elements and tell its own unique story. I think the use of Sonic was very, very impressive and fully realized for at least the type of Sonic character that I remember. And you have these type of movies that are very familiar in terms of you have like an animated character interacting with a live action character, and sometimes that can actually be kind of corny. But that isn't the case with this film. There's actually a lot of heart, and I would even like to say that Sonic and Donut Lord actually have a pretty good friendship, and to see that kind of build over the course of the film is really good. But without a doubt, the best thing about this film is Jim Carrey. Now, Jim Carrey was probably my favorite actor during the 90s, and the fact that Sonic is a 90s character works perfectly. He absolutely kills it as Dr. Robotnik. And I think that the final battle at the end is a perfect representation of a Sonic battle between Sonic and Dr. Eggman that we've seen from the games. That was fully realized. And I'm telling you, I cannot wait to see what they do with Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which, heck, they just recently announced that they kind of showed like a little banner showing the title. So trust me, this film was actually great. This wasn't just a good video game based movie, it was a great one. And I cannot wait to see what they do with the next one. And trust me, if you haven't seen it already, what the hell is your problem? Because I think whether you're a fan or not, you're going to have a good time with this film. So that is why it's number 2 on my list. Now, number 1 on my list really shouldn't surprise most people, because as much as numbers 4 to 2 have been very good films, even great films in some points, my overall favorite video game based movie of all time has to go to 1995's Mortal Kombat. This film at least for me, actually managed to do everything right if you're a fan. Now, I would say that Mortal Kombat leans more into the direction of this is really more for a fan than a casual viewer. But when it comes to the franchise it's based off itself, it's without doubt my favorite above any other franchise that was actually able to pull off a really good or even great video game based movie to date. I mean, the fact that this really managed to take a story that has very little depth in general, because when you really look at the first Mortal Kombat movie, it doesn't even have much of a story. It has a concept, but I think that this movie actually did a really good job of actually giving some backstory and some depth to a very, very simple, just simple concept. Now, I thought that the acting doesn't need to be Oscar worthy, but it needs to be actually good. And I think that all the characters in the film are really good. And I was actually surprised that they were actually able to add in all of the fighters that were in the first game. That in itself is a challenge. I mean, you have Liu Kang, Shang Tsung, Sub-Zero, Scorpion, Sonya, Kano, Johnny Cage, Raiden, and even Goro. I mean, the animatronic Goro, even to this day, looks really good. The fighting is good. Hell, the soundtrack is amazing. I mean, the soundtrack went platinum, and this came out in '95, and it's still iconic to this day. And the fact that the next video game based movie that I actually do plan to see is actually the next Mortal Kombat movie that comes out on HBO Max. I mean, that's just how great that this film was. And the fact that came from Paul W.S. Anderson, who would actually go on to make the first Resident Evil movie. So this guy really at least has some experience or just has some sort of aura in terms of making video game based movies. And I think without a doubt, his best one to date is the first Mortal Kombat movie. I mean, there's just so much goodness about it. I can't even think of anything that I would even change. I thought the castings was great, the fighting is great, the music I said it was great, the visuals were great, the locations were great. This is how you do it. This is how you make a video game based movie that actually is loyal and faithful to the content that you're basing it off of. Now, some people would complain that the only reason that they might not consider it all that great is because it doesn't have blood. I understand that, okay, but they have to make it PG-13 so that I could see it in theaters because heck, I was able to see it in theaters and I had a damn good time seeing it back then, even even as a 5-year-old. And some people say that it doesn't have fatalities, and I'd have to disagree with you on that because people are getting killed. They may not be, having their spinal cords ripped out or their hearts ripped out or being turned into ash or being blown up or stuff like that. But they are getting killed in pretty effective ways, and that's something that holds up even to this day, which is why, in my opinion, the first Mortal Kombat movie is without doubt my all-time favorite video game-based movie of all time. So now that you guys know my personal top 5, if you guys can pick any 5 video game-based movies that you think are any good, share your list with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I will see you next time.